Okay, excellent. Thanks so much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. It's quite early here in Seattle. Sorry, give me a second. My slides aren't advancing. There we go. I just wanted to start with an image of where I'm coming from, Seattle, Washington. Maybe you have seen the Space Needle before, built here for the 1962 World's Fair. And we're surrounded by snow-capped mountains, some of which are volcanic. It's a lovely place to live. In today's talk, I really want to highlight the work of several graduate students and postdocs in my group, particularly Marc Bourgeois, who's up here on the upper right corner, along with Elliot Butler, Harrison Goldwyn, and Claire West. Again, I apologize. I have a cold. I hope you can hear me okay. And
It's
together,
fine, no worry.
it's fine. Great, thank you. Together, we are all a theory group here at the University of Washington that works broadly across in several different areas, but of interest to this group here, single particle spectroscopy using optical techniques. We also have a branch of our work using focused electron beams in the electron microscope, also doing single particle microscopy and spectroscopy. But I want to focus on the optical stuff today. Um, and today's talk really has two parts. I want to quickly go through some past work on using light and the photothermal effect to direct thermal gradients in nanofabricated clusters of plasmonic nanoparticles, like you see here, a dimer, a trimer, and I mean individual dimers, individual trimers, to control thermal gradients in these kinds of systems and to actively control it. What I mean by that is simply changing the wavelength of light can shift the thermal gradient from being biased one way onto one particle onto another particle within the cluster, simply by changing the wavelength of light. And then I'm going to go through that quickly because what I really want to focus on is the new stuff that we're working on, and this has to do with again exploiting the photothermal effect to control thermal gradients in plasmonic nanomaterials, but over much larger length scales in photonic crystal lattices. These are periodic assemblies of, in this case, plasmonic nanoparticles, where now we can use light and exploit not only the frequency of light, but the polarization and the wave vector of light to sculpt thermal gradients under steady state illumination across many microns in these kinds of lattice systems, as well as within the unit cells themselves. And so I'll get to that towards the end of my talk. And I will, at the very end, push into a regime where these kinds of photonic crystals can realize non-trivial topological phases, where I'll show you some theoretical evidence of the existence of thermal edge localized thermal modes that cling surprisingly to the edges of these finite crystal arrays and taper off in the interior where they remain cooler. So, well, just a little bit of background here. My talk involves photothermal heating of plasmonic nanoparticles, where both absorption and scattering mechanisms are important. Particles are big enough, maybe 50, 100 nanometers, 200 nanometers in size, where scattering effects actually arise and can be quite important. Of course, extinction represents the sum total of both scattering and or radiative and non-radiative processes. Um, uh, for the in the case of considering only the absorption process, of course, it's the absorption cross-section of the structure that dictates the heat power that is absorbed and that ultimately gets converted into temperature rise, both inside the nanostructure as well as outside the nanostructure. And of course, that depends upon the thermal conductivity of the environment. So this story begins back in 2014, where together with a graduate student, Chris Baldwin, we started to play around with a plasmonic nanorod system with four nanorods. The outer two are on the order of 200 nanometers in length, and the inner two are on the order of 250 nanometers in length. I don't remember the numbers exactly, but they're slightly different. And four gold nanorods, of course, when brought together, form four hybridized plasmonic modes, two of which are bright, two of which are dark. The two that are bright, that are optically bright, I'm showing you here. That's the all in phase mode and the out of phase mode here. There are two others that are optically dark that I'm disregarding. And so we had this idea that if we could drive optically linear combinations of these hybridized modes, that we could create under CW illumination, we could drive states of this coupled plasmonic system that localized either on the outer two or the inner two rods. You can just take plus minus linear combinations in your head to see that. And so we started thinking about, well, what are the consequences on the heat power absorbed and the temperature rise that would result from driving this coupled system at these certain wavelengths that would excite these linear combinations of normal modes. And this was really quite surprising to us. So we calculated numerically the heat power absorbed, and the heat power, that's these upper two plots at two different wavelengths, the in phase and out of phase linear combination wavelengths, localized to the outer two or inner two rods within this structure. And okay, fine. Then we thought, well, certainly if we solve the heat diffusion equation in steady state, right, it would never be that the temperature would be any different on any of the four particles. We thought it would always be the same. But in fact, we were wrong. So numerically solving in steady state the heat diffusion equation led to a temperature profile for the in-phase mode that actually preferentially was hotter on the outer two rods than the inner two rods, and vice versa at the other linear combination, the other way around happened. This was really quite surprising to us. And I forgot to say here, the background is water. And I'm sorry, earlier I said gold. I meant to say silver for the composition of the rods. It doesn't matter. The same thing works with gold. And really the secret of the spices here is that the thermal conductivity of water is two or three orders of magnitude below that of silver. And so what that means is the ambient thermally conductive environment serves as an insulating jacket around each one of these nanoparticles so that heat cannot efficiently outcouple and flow and equilibrate the temperature across the tetramer structure. And so here you're just seeing a couple of lineouts of the increase above room temperature of the thermal profile of these four rods driven at each wavelength. So this is all great in principle, but does it work in practice? And so that started a long-term collaboration with Stefan Link and Kelly Willits, both of which have given or will give seminars as part of the seminar series, where we actually nanofabricate. And but when I say we, I mean them. I'm a theoretician. I didn't go into the lab and do any of this myself, but they nanofabricated a heterorod dimer, the lengths of which were just larger than the diffraction limit of light. And they did photothermal heterodyne imaging and imaged the point spread function as a function of driving at either the bonding resonance wavelength or the anti-bonding resonance wavelength. If you can see my hands, that's the bonding and that's the anti-bonding in this rod dimer structure. And it turns out that the bonding mode localizes heat power preferentially on the long rod, and the anti-bonding mode preferentially localizes heat on the short rod. And so what they saw is they actually saw biasing in the photothermal image point spread function rightward or leftward that we were able with theory to tease out and correlate that back to underlying thermal gradients that they were controlling with light biasing rightward or leftward linearly in this dimer structure. We then went on and shrunk the nanosystem down in a trimer system. I don't recall if it was gold or silver, it doesn't matter, but the particles are three of them, and they are all three smaller than the diffraction limit of light. Again, they performed photothermal heterodyne imaging and saw no gross leftward or rightward biasing of the photothermal image function. Instead, what we were able to do was tease out, based on changes in ellipticity of the photothermal image function, compared to that of a reference disk on the same slide as these trimer structures, we were able to correlate, again with theory, changes in ellipticity back to thermal gradients that were getting set up, either running in the Y direction or the X direction, if you will, on this trimer system. So I now want to take the remainder of my talk and talk about these lattice systems. These are often called photonic crystals in the case where they are composed of dielectrics. In this case, these are plasmon lattices because they're composed of noble metal nanoparticles. The physics is essentially the same in either case. And the way we're going to model these systems is that every one of these plasmonic nanostructures, I want you to think of as just to lowest order a little time-dependent oscillating dipole that interacts radiatively through the radiation field with all other dipoles in all other unit cells until they come into self-consistency with each other. One thing I didn't say is that the unit cells in these kinds of crystals are huge. So typical unit cell length, could be 500 nanometers or 400 nanometers. So these dipoles are interacting with each other not through the near field, but through the intermediate and far field of the dipole. Okay. So due to their discrete space translation invariance, it's not surprising that the emergent collective modes of the plasmon lattices, called surface lattice resonances, exhibit strong energy momentum dispersion. They inherit that from their light component. They are the hybridization of the optical modes of an empty unit cell, hybridizing with a plasmonic particle or plasmonic dipole to lowest order in that unit cell. And by mode mixing the two, that's how the emergent SLR, surface lattice resonance, form. And again, they exhibit strong band dispersion from their light component. Also, if we peer into a unit cell, like you see down here, interestingly, they also exhibit very strong spatial inhomogeneity of the cavity field. So this is the induced electric field inside of just one unit cell. So here I have just an illustration that if you imagine having different molecules or emitters that are located at different points within the unit cell, they would experience different degrees of light matter coupling, different cavity fields. So like before in the first phase of our work, we went out ahead of experiment and did some theoretical work to try to predict the photothermal properties of these kinds of plasmonic lattice systems. So the simplest case is just a 1D lattice where the interparticle spacing is 415 nanometers. And what we did here is we just simply grew the radius of each particle in each unit cell. This is a Brevet lattice. And what we see here, on the color axis, this is the absorption spectrum, or the absorption cross-section. A horizontal line here would be the absorption spectrum. And what you see is that as you start to grow the radius of the particle, for small radii, the particles are not big enough to appreciably scatter. And so you just have single particle absorption. Every unit cell is independent of the other unit cells. But as the particle radius starts to get bigger, such that the particles appreciably scatter, then they communicate with each other through the radiative intermediate and far zone fields. And this collective surface lattice resonance of the assembly emerges. So we grab that radius of roughly 45 nanometers, and we use that for all the calculations going forward. And so what you see here is the absorption, the momentum resolved absorption cross section as a function of tipping the angle of incidence of the excitation field for a lattice of 45 nanometer radius, 90 nanometer diameter particles separated by 415 nanometers. And so you see that strong energy momentum dispersion of the surface lattice resonance mode down here. This is the light-like hybridized mode. The matter-like hybridized mode is up here. And so the first thing we did is we just simply illuminated the lattice. This is at the gamma point under normal incidence with a plane wave field where we just blew out the width of the plane wave. In the smallest, we took a finite lattice of 80 microns in length overall dimensions, just a 1D lattice, and just blew out the width from 4 microns centered at the origin of the lattice all the way out to having a big broad beam waist that covers the whole thing. And the wavelength that we chose, or the frequency that we chose to excite the system, was at the surface lattice resonance frequency that you see here. And I'm contrasting that back to the single particle frequency. Where did that go? That was back here, the single particle frequency down here. So you're looking at two different temperature increases. One, progressively blowing out the width, driving the system at the surface lattice resonance. And I want you to contrast that back to this blue curve back here, which is just the single particle LSP, driving at the single particle LSP resonance across the same array, using the exact same incident intensity of light. So you can see that there's a massive increase in temperature rise by driving the system at the collective surface lattice resonance rather than at the single particle resonance. Okay. Then we went to the simplest possible non-Brevet unit cell. Now we have two sublattices, and we examined both homo and heterodimer unit cells. And not unsurprisingly, within the unit cell, the modes mix into in phase and out of phase linear combinations. And then you can imagine those modes now hybridizing in the lattice assembly into collective surface lattice resonances. And so you're looking at down here the case where we had the homodimer Brevet dimer lattice and the heterodimer non-Brevet lattice. And not unsurprisingly, there are asymmetries in the emergent band structure just due to the fact that the heterodimer has an asymmetry within the unit cell itself. And so we started thinking about, can we design unit cells in a way
David,
that...
excuse me, David, only 3 minutes left.
3 minutes. Okay, great.
Yep.
Thank you. Can we design unit cells where we can control the thermal gradients not only within the unit cell using light, but also macroscopically across the entire lattice? And so indeed we can. And so again, this is getting out ahead of experiment. Maybe the take-home message here, this is for the homodimer case, the top row, the heterodimer case is the bottom row. This is illumination at the gamma point. And you can see that we're able to engineer thermal gradients not only across, in this case, 80 micron scale of the lattice, but also within the unit cell itself. The unit cell in this case is on the order of a couple of 100 nanometers. And this is all actively controllable. If you tilt the angle of incidence, this is at the gamma point, but if we come off the gamma point, then these thermal gradients are all actively tunable. So the last part of the talk in the last 2 minutes, I want to just turn over to some of the topological effects that we anticipate in these kinds of structures. And I want to go back to the model of Sushri-Verheeger, the so-called SSH model, which is a prototypical model for topological trivial effects. The model describes a charge hopping, a spinless electron hopping along polyacetylene, and where as a function of the carbon-carbon double bond hopping rate to the carbon-carbon single bond hopping rate, what you're looking at here is the eigenspectrum of a finite piece of polyacetylene. And so what you see here is that when this ratio crosses one, and the inter-unit cell hopping rate exceeds that of the intra-unit cell hopping rate, then two states coalesce at zero energy. This is a conductive state. And in the finite polyacetylene lattice, these are the two degenerate eigenvectors. They are so-called edge localized. And there's a very powerful theorem called the bulk boundary correspondence theorem that actually proves the existence of edge localized modes in this regime. So properties of the bulk influence properties of the finite system. So this polyacetylene molecule with intra and inter-unit cell hopping rates is analogous to the dimer Brevet, or sorry, non-Brevet lattice system that I was studying before. So we had this idea of, can we tune the hopping rates by changing the interparticle spacing both within the unit cell and between unit cells in order to drive the system into a non-trivial topological regime. There are, I should caution, major differences between the SSH model and that of Plasmon lattices. Most notably, the SSH model is a nearest neighbor model, whereas in the Plasmon lattices, all dipoles across the entire lattice all communicate with each other. Nevertheless, we were able to go through and calculate the Berry phase, which was an extremely painful, tedious task to do, to verify that we had pushed our system into the non-trivial topological regime. And interestingly, I'll have you focus down here on the bottom plot. What we found is that in a 1D Brevet lattice, like you see here, maybe just focus on this blue curve here, that we actually calculated the temperature rise, and we're zoomed in here just on the far left edge of a finite lattice that I think was 80 microns in length. And this was really shocking to us, that the temperature rise grew in right at the edge of the lattice and fell back, and not quite to room temperature. There's a reason for that I can explain later if you're interested in. But there is a stark contrast in the thermal gradient being basically homogeneous and very low, the temperature being quite low in the bulk region of the lattice, and then rises up on the edge. And so my very last slide here extends this to 2D, and things are a lot more complicated than 2D. But maybe if you just focus down here on these bottom panels, we're just exciting the lattice at two different energies or frequencies at the X point, and I'm showing you the thermal gradient rise that clings to the edge that you see down here, and it falls off back to room temperature or closer to room temperature in the bulk. And this is extremely unusual, and I have this kind of silly picture here because this is not at all how we experience temperature. We know when we cook our food, for example, we put the pan on the stove and the entire pan heats up. What I'm telling you here is that, at least theoretically, what we're predicting is the existence of materials that heat up on the outside, but the middle where you cook your food, remains cooler. And this is very peculiar and is awaiting experimental evidence at this point. But I think there's some really neat applications that could come out of this if indeed this ends up being correct. So lastly, just to summarize, we briefly looked at photothermal control of temperature gradients in clusters of nanoparticles, nanofabricated clusters of nanoparticles. We then moved on to lattices and looked at extending optically controllable thermal gradients across hundreds of microns, as well as across the dimensions of the unit cell. And then I made a tantalizing prediction about topologically non-trivial effects and their consequences on temperature in photonic crystal lattices. And so lastly, I just want to thank our team. The team is funded by the National Science Foundation's DEMREF program and involves myself, Stefan Link, who you all know, and Catherine Kelly Willits here. So thank you all very much for your attention, and I'm very happy to take questions.
Thanks a lot, David, for this intriguing talk and very exciting predictions. It would be nice to see that confirmed. Other questions? Frank Sichos, please, Frank, just speak up.
Yes, thank you also very much for the very nice talk. I was wondering, so I didn't quite get the topological point, but the topology lies in the plasmonic coupling, and which leads to the generation of temperature, while it's not in the diffusive part of the heat propagation, right? Am I right?
Good question. So we so we that's exactly right. So in solving the Maxwell's equations for the underlying the optical coupling of the essentially just dipoles in the lattice, that's where the topological effects live. They lived in the Hamiltonian underlying the dipole-dipole interactions.
Mm-hmm.
And so there are interactions within the unit cell at short distance. There are then longer distances between unit cells, and simply the topological effects come in from the ratio of the intra-unit cell hopping rate or coupling rate to the inter-unit cell coupling rate. As a separate second step, all we did was solve the heat diffusion equation in steady state to calculate, for example, this blue curve that you see here, the temperature rise. There are no additional topological effects or physics that's built in at the level of the heat diffusion equation.
So you would presumably also see the topological effects in the scattering of the array?
Good question. So I think the answer is yes, Frank. Looking here, I was rushing, unfortunately, in the end. I hope you can see this. What I'm showing you in these upper panels are the induced dipole moments. And you can see that the induced dipole moments also highly localized to the edges and would underlie edge localized scattering as well. Yeah. Correct.
Okay, thank you. Very nice. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. I don't see another raised hand, so I can ask my own question. So I take it that you used steady state condition, right, for your results.
That's correct.
So I was wondering whether you might not use modulated heating as a sort of additional handle to influence, to make the decay length of this modulated heating will be shortened by of course, the damping of heat waves, so to speak. So
yeah, sure.
Is that interesting to do? Or?
Yeah, it's not something that I had thought of, but I absolutely agree. There are all sorts of directions that can come out of this, and including that, launching thermal waves with different propagation lengths that are originating from certain points in space and not others, all of which would be actively controllable from the far field with light. This is a program really that's been invested in by the U.S. National Science Foundation for 6 years. And I feel like in many regards, we're just now beginning to uncover all sorts of interesting new directions. And so thank you, Michelle. That's
nice.
a very interesting idea.
Thanks a lot. I don't see any more questions. So unfortunately, David will have to leave for family reasons. Has to.
So there is a question in chat, Michelle.
Oh, there is a question in chat. Oh, yes, I didn't see that. Let me check. So please speak up. I don't see the question immediately.
It says, what have you used as a substrate for your samples with the dimer lattice? Yeah, great question, Alexei. So off the top of my head, I don't recall, but what we used was the for the optical part of the calculation, the plasmonic particles are sitting in an environment of it's either vacuum or air or water, and then the corresponding thermal conductivity for, forget I said vacuum, air or water, we would then use the corresponding thermal conductivity for air or water in the steady state heat diffusion part of the companion calculation for that.
Thank you, David. Yeah.